guys, it's Nicole and welcome back to my channel. If you guys follow me on Instagram, yesterday you would have seen that I posted this bloom from my Cycnoches orchid. It's the first time I've ever bloomed this orchid, and I find them very different from Catasetum. So in this video, I want to share some of the challenges that I had growing this orchid and share the differences between some of my other Catasetum orchids. Now, before we jump into that, I want to show you a close-up of these beautiful blooms. So Cycnoches orchids, they tend to be very flat and swan-like. They're very, very pretty. This one is the Cycnoches Richard Brandon crossed with the Marin Gleason. I got it from Sunset Valley Orchids, and it's just so nice. And I want to figure out how to grow these well, because I killed one of them last year. So I want to learn from what I did wrong and share some of the adaptations that I've made to make these grow. So when we think of Cycnoches orchids, we usually lump them into the category of Catasetum orchids. With Catasetum orchids, if you guys saw my last video on Catasetums, they tend to grow very quickly in the spring and in the summer, and then they go into a dormant period in the winter. Now, when I repot my orchids, I tend to cut all of the roots off. I did that with this orchid because I just thought, why don't I just treat it like a Catasetum? Well, I was wrong. I killed one of my Cycnoches orchids last year. Its name was Cycnoches Brown's Choice. It was a nice one, but you know, these guys are very prone to rot. If you water them a little too early, they're not very forgiving. Their roots die very easily. And then also I find it's very hard to get them hydrated. And care is very environment dependent, in my opinion. There's people that grow these in different environments and they treat them differently. So if you live in humid Florida, South Florida that is, you're probably going to have a different experience from me. So where I struggle with these orchids is in the transition from the dry winter rest to the growing season. And what I've noticed is that when I water these orchids, even if they have some roots that are long enough, sometimes they die. So that's what happened with this orchid actually. I watered and all roots stopped growing. So I thought this was going to be a goner, but I just backed off on the water a little bit and then the roots started coming in. Now, when I repotted this orchid, I would have done something very different now that I know that these are a little bit more sensitive. So this is what I'd say is like a seedling orchid because the bulbs are quite small. If you could see the roots, it doesn't have too many roots. If you saw my Monuraro Millennium Magic Witchcraft, that was full of roots. This one is just a little bit less vigorous than that hybrid in particular. And I just think that these guys, when you cut their roots off, they sort of have to start from scratch and develop a whole new root system. So if I were to do this over in my climate and my environment, when I got this orchid from Sunset Valley Orchids, it came in a 3-inch pot. Instead of cutting off the old roots, just given that this orchid is a little bit smaller, I would have up-potted it into a larger pot and just put sphagnum moss around the root ball. I think with Cycnoches orchids, when you have that tricky part of watering and you have new roots, those new roots are really sensitive, and I think that the old roots can help out if those new roots fail, just given that it's so sensitive. Early watering is not the only issue with these orchids. I find that in the winter, they get very dry very quickly. So in my environment, my humidity levels are between 30 and 40%, which is on the pretty low spectrum for these kinds of orchids. Ideally, we'd want them in 60 to 70% humidity. So with my Brown's Choice orchid, I noticed that it just started desiccating and it just dried up into a raisin. So you're sort of in a position with these orchids where it's kind of difficult to know when to water, but also you don't want to rot them out. So the answer tends to be give it more humidity. So, I mean, from what I've learned, I'd say with a smaller Cycnoches orchid, you'd want to keep the old root system, not cut it off like I do with my Catasetum orchids. It sort of gives you a backup, sort of like a battery where you could fall back on that more mature root system in case the new root system is going to give you trouble. Care for any orchid is environment dependent, so what works for me here may not work for you in your environment, but I think just from my experience that the humidity levels have a lot to do with the success or demise of this orchid. What I did by cutting off the old roots with a Cycnoches orchid that's a seedling, I think is a little bit risky. If you think about it, the pseudo bulbs, if they're nice and large, they probably have a lot of energy and have the ability to push out a lot more roots than something that's a lot smaller. And you have that issue where these are just tougher to root in general. So now that we know that humidity is a problem, at least here in New York City, I wanted to share a solution that I came across that I thought was very helpful. So Sunset Valley Orchids has a monthly newsletter that goes out to folks who have bought orchids from them. And one of the newsletters about a year ago brought up the low humidity problem. And there was a solution where a lot of growers have started putting their pots right over a cup of water. And what that does is it provides extra ambient humidity to the root ball. So what this is doing is during the dry winter rest, if it's too dry, the bulbs are desiccating, instead of watering and risking rotting your roots, you can put your pot over a cup of water, and that'll provide extra humidity to help plump those growths back up. I think that sort of trick will help a Cycnoches orchid because, as we know, their roots are very, very difficult. They'll rot quickly, and their bulbs will desiccate fast. So I think that's a solution that I'm going to be using from now on, especially in the winter when you stop watering. It'll help with that humidity level and keeping the orchid hydrated without rotting their roots. I'm still new to these orchids. I killed one last year, which was very frustrating, but now that this one has bloomed, I feel like I've learned a lot that I'm going to put into practice. A good resource for these kinds of orchids is Stefan Van Kampen Lewis. He made a video on Cycnoches orchids a couple of months ago, and I asked him to do it because I was struggling so much, and it was a very helpful video. So I'm going to post his video and link it down below so you could check it out. And just remember that care for any kind of orchid is very environment dependent. Personally, I think that humidity is a big factor for this one, but let me know down in the comments below the experience that you've had with these kinds of orchids. If you like this video, don't forget to give it a thumbs up and subscribe for more orchid content. Thanks everyone. Bye.